roadside history fans, welcome back to the channel. My name is Daniel, and today I'm taking you to a massacre site in Utah where one of the worst overland trail massacres happened in American history. It's known as the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It's sacred ground, and it's an event that took place in 1857 that could have been avoided and didn't need to happen. Stay tuned as I tell you about the Baker and Fancher party, a group of immigrants out of Arkansas, 140 strong, that would be massacred in this area known as Mountain Meadows. When you arrive at the Mountain Meadows Massacre site, you'll see this sign that represents a historical marker for the area. As you begin up this walkway, the walkway is about 200 yards from the bottom to the top, and the incline isn't too tough. You'll come across several historical markers on your hike up the hill, and eventually you'll come to the summit of the hill where you'll see the historical marker and granite memorial that was put in place several years ago. The summit looks out over the valley where the actual siege took place, as well as the men's and women's massacre sites. And on this large granite memorial are the names of all the immigrants who lost their lives here at Mountain Meadows in 1857. What you're looking at now is a view of the valley to where the immigrants brought their horses and their cattle so that they could water them along their journey to California. It's a pretty lush area, and given that this is the summer, things look dry, but normally it's pretty lush, and there is a small stream that runs right through the middle of where the siege area took place. Again, now you're looking across the valley, and those trees in the center of your screen is about where the siege with the Mormon militia took place. As I tell you the story of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, it's important to understand the history and how this tragic event unfolded, how a perfect storm culminated together. At this point in American history, Utah was a territory. The governor of the territory was a man by the name of Brigham Young. Brigham Young was also the leader of the LDS Church, also known as the Mormons. Well, in the 1850s, this is a period of time known as the Utah Reformation. It's a time where Brigham Young and church leaders were encouraging followers of the church to do better, to be better, to recommit themselves. And it took on a really aggressive fervor, if you will. Brigham Young and his leaders gave fiery speeches about repenting and being rebaptized and so on and so forth. Well, to make a long story short, at the same time, there's a lot of hostility in Utah for the Mormons towards the federal government. As you probably are well aware, the federal government did nothing to protect the Mormons when they were driven from Missouri and then driven from Nauvoo, and they trekked west to present-day Utah. They did nothing to stop the violence and the hatred, and the people living in the area still remembered that. And as the tensions grew and mounted, President Buchanan, who was the President of the United States at the time, he was going to remove Brigham Young as a territorial governor. And in removing him as a territorial governor, naturally this spiked hostilities again and sentiment toward the federal government. To make matters worse, as 1,500 federal troops were making their way to Utah, Brigham Young had called back members of the church who were on missions and other members and basically told them to prepare. As some of those preparations would take place, as they felt that war was imminent and the Utah war was going to happen, Brigham Young encouraged members to make all preparations, to stockpile goods, grain, and other things that they may need to protect themselves and sustain themselves should a battle take place. Well, to culminate that fervor that these federal troops were coming in May of 1857, a Mormon apostle by the name of Parley P. Pratt was murdered in Arkansas. Parley P. Pratt was incredibly popular to the Mormons, and this created a sentiment again toward people from that area, more persecution that was going undone, more wrongs that weren't being prosecuted, and this led to heightened tensions. Well, the perfect storm would happen in September of that year as a group of Arkansas immigrants, about 140 of them and 35 wagons and hundreds of cattle, began to work their way through the Utah territory en route to California. What's going to take place is members of the church weren't trading and selling to this group of immigrants coming through. They weren't allowing their cattle to graze on their land, and it was creating hostilities between the two. In fact, some members of the Arkansas group had threatened to join with the federal troops. Some had even claimed to be present when Joseph Smith, who was the Mormon prophet before Brigham Young, was murdered in Carthage, Illinois. Nevertheless, this group began to work their way south, and as they got near Cedar City, the hostilities grew. As you leave the Hilltop Memorial, you can take a short drive to the Siege Memorial, which is what these signs talk about. As the immigrants came through Cedar City, naturally they just wanted to feed their families and their livestock. And on the same token, the Mormons were doing as they were directed by their church leaders to stockpile all goods in case of war with the federal government. Isaac Haight, a Mormon leader in the area of Cedar City, sent a man by the name of John D. Lee to attack this immigrant train. Several people objected to Mr. Haight's direction and sent for Brigham Young to intervene. He did intervene, but by the time his message got back to let them pass with no harm, the siege had already taken place. You know, when I was a little boy, my dad brought me to this place. It's several hours from where I grew up, but he brought me here. I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and I'll never forget being here. I didn't remember the story. It wouldn't be until I was probably, 25 years old before I would return to this spot. But I didn't remember the story, but I do remember the burial place where the army came in and buried so many of these souls that were left out on the ground and just basically left to rot, and their bodies are, and it was a terrible situation. But I remember coming here, and I remember this burial site, and I remember it well enough that it left an impact on me. And when I returned here some 25 years later, it all made sense. Anyway, the area that I'm taking you to now is the burial site, to where when the army came in, they saw these souls and their bodies littered out on the ground. They took them and buried them. When you enter the memorial site, right before you go through the gates, there's a placard that gives you a little history on the actual memorial cairn. The U.S. Army built the memorial cairn with a large cross on top, but over years it weathered and a new one was built. This field is where the siege actually began. Now, as I take you through the gate and into the memorial, you'll notice that there are a lot of flowers and wreaths, as many people still visit this area and pay their respects to the many people in the Arkansas group that were murdered at the hands of these Mormon militiamen. Along the sides, the north, south, east, and west sides of the memorial are granite headstones that were added sometime later, but also they provide the names of the different individuals and their families that were killed here in Mountain Meadows in 1857. As you work your way around the memorial, it's quite large, but as you work your way around the memorial, on the south end, there's another little history marker on the memorial that you can see in front of you now that gives you a little bit more history about the area. On the northwest side of the memorial corner, an area that we're heading to now, there is a placard that tells you about the siege area. The siege area is where the Arkansas group had circled their wagons when they were being attacked by the militiamen, dug shallow pits to defend themselves, and this placard tells you about that. The area I'm taking you to right now is the siege spot, where this siege started by these Mormon militiamen. The siege spot is about 250 yards from the burial area that I just showed you. As you work your way around the siege area, there's a very well-groomed walking path, very easy walk, very little to any incline. As you work your way around, this valley that you're looking at right now is where the wagon trains were circled, and they dug shallow trenches to hunker down in and shoot from to protect their families from these individuals that were coming to harm them. As you continue to work your way around the area here, you'll come across another placard, another marker that represents the only man who was ever tried and convicted for this massacre, John D. Lee. He was brought here on the spot 20-something years later, and executed here in this area. This is the picture of John D. Lee sitting on his coffin moments before his execution. About a half-mile north of the parking lot to Mountain Meadows is where you'll find the Men and Boys Massacre site. There's a couple of historical signs here that will give you a little bit of background and a little bit more information on it, as well as a granite memorial marker and bench for those that want to come and sit in the area. What happened was, after the 5th day of fighting, the militiamen convinced the Arkansas men to surrender and enter into a peace. The Arkansas men, in fear of their families' lives, decided that was the best route to go. And so they did that. They gave up their weapons and they lined the men and the boys, aged 7 years old and older, up and walked them across this valley. When they got to this valley, a militiaman declared, "Men, do your duty." At that point, militiamen opened fire on these Arkansas immigrants and slaughtered them right here in this field. A few hundred yards to the north of the men's memorial is the women's memorial. There's some interesting signs here to give you some information, as well as a good groomed walkway. It's about a 100-yard walk to the actual memorial site. The women were separated from their husbands and brought to this location, where they were then executed as well. Again, anyone over 7 years old was executed because the militiamen figured anyone younger wouldn't be able to report the story. It's important to know 120 immigrants lost their lives at Mountain Meadows. Their 17 surviving children were eventually returned to distant family living back in Arkansas. It's also important to understand that the Mormon Church and Brigham Young did not order this attack. Rather, some members acted out alone against Brigham Young's wishes. Thanks for joining us on Roadside History and learning a little bit more about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to my channel.